We concluded part 2 by gluing the fretboard to the neck. And now it's time to lay out the neck pocket so we can carve it. But before doing that, we need to align the neck and the body. There's a lot of different ways to do this step, but I used a very simple method that makes sense to me and hopefully it will make sense to you too. So the first thing we're gonna do is mark the position of the neck pocket in relation to this side of the body. According to the plan, that's 32.6 centimeters. So I just put a mark right there on the center line. Next, I clamp 2 straight edges against the sides of the neck. Then I position the heel of the neck so that its center line sits on top of the line that we just drew. This is now a pivot point and we need to find a second fixed point. To do that, I just drew a random line that is square to the center line of the body and away from the first point. Then, by trial and error, I try to find the angle that puts the center line right between the 2 straight edges. Now that the neck is aligned with the body, we can clamp everything in place. Clamp the body to the workbench, then the neck to the body, and finally clamp the headstock to the workbench, just to make sure that nothing will move. Now that everything is clamped, we can safely remove the straight edges. I used the marking knife to mark the position of the heel, and then I put some masking tape on top of the line just to make it more visible. Now we can take the neck out of the way and start marking the depth of the neck pocket. Here I'm marking a line at 16 mm from the top of the body. That's because we want the top of the fretboard to be 9 mm higher than the plane of the body, and the neck and the fretboard together are 25 mm. If your neck and fretboard are not exactly 25 mm, then you need to redo the maths. For the 2 corners, the plan says that the radius is 14 mm, but I don't have a 14 mm drill bit. So instead I used the 9.5 mm bit. I used some masking tape as a depth stop, and it's set to be a little less than 16 mm. To remove the bulk of the material, I used some 15, 20 and 25 mm Forstner bits, but you can use any combination you want. You don't have to lay out the holes like I did. I just didn't want them to overlap. Again, I'm aiming for a little less than 16 mm. And that's because I don't want the pointy end of the Forstner bit to be visible. This step is not at all needed, but remember, I made this neck pocket with just one hand, so I had to try any technique that would make my life easier. Now I keep removing as much wood as I can. There's no real pattern here, just remove anything you can, doesn't matter how. Just make sure that you don't go past the bottom line and the contours of the neck pocket. Your worst enemy while doing this is wood splitting. I'll explain in the next video. Okay, I said that the radiusing of the fretboard was the worst part of this project. Well, I lied. I'm sorry. This is the worst part of the project. Not only is it tedious, but it's also a very delicate and critical part of the project. The neck pocket must have a consistent depth, and the bottom line has to be flat, and I mean dead flat. On the other hand, the sides don't matter too much, because the alignment of the neck mostly relies on the bolts, so just focus on the bottom of the pocket. I don't want to scare you off, but to me this was the most complicated part of the project. So if you have a router, or a friend who has a router, or even someone you don't like but who happens to have a router, then please don't do this by hand. I wasn't sure this would work, so I used this technique very early on in the neck pocket carving. Let me explain. I clamped a stack of scrap wood in front of the neck pocket. This gave me a flat reference for my chisel, at a given height. Then I simply quote-unquote pushed my chisel in, with the bevel up, making sure that the blade of the chisel never went below the plane of the stack of wood. To get to the final line, keep playing with the stack of wood, making it lower and lower until you get to the desired height. Here I got very close to the line, so it was time to take care of this fluffiness here, and clean the walls of the pocket. This step may look complicated to non-woodworkers, but it's actually very easy. Let's demystify it. Use your fretting hand to grab the chisel and hold it vertically, and then use your strumming hand to strike the chisel down. There's nothing more to it. For this side, the chisel is cutting across the grain, so nothing can go wrong. Just make sure that you're not too greedy and make small cuts. It's all gonna depend on how hard your wood is. And make sure that your chisel is sharp. If you struggle doing this, there can only be 2 explanations. 1, your chisel is dull, and 2, you're trying to remove too much wood at a time. That's it. For this side, you can use a square piece of stock to guide the chisel, so it's perfectly straight. Because you're cutting with the grain, the risk of having your chisel tracking the wood fibers is very high, so be very careful while doing this. Now that the sides are clean, you can use the chisel and clean the bottom. I used my poor man's hand router again and made tiny cuts to get to the desired depth. This technique also makes sure that the bottom of the neck pocket is now parallel to the top of the body. Now that the neck is loosely fitted inside the neck pocket, we can make the final adjustment. Just put the straight edges back and repeat what we've done minutes ago. Then clamp everything in place. To hold the neck plate in place, I used a small piece of double-sided tape. To screw the neck plate in place and secure the neck, I drilled 4 pilot holes in the body, and then extended those with 4 smaller holes in the heel of the neck. Now it's time to install the bridge, so we know where to carve the bridge pickup cavity, and where to drill the string through holes. To determine the placement of the bridge, you'll need to measure the distance from the nut to the 12th thread, and then double that distance to know where the saddles of the bridge are supposed to sit. That's called the scale length of the guitar. And in this case, the scale length is 25.5 inches. When the bridge is correctly positioned, you can screw it in place and mark the positions of the string through holes. As you may know, the strings on a Telecaster travel all the way through the body and stick out of the bridge through 6 little holes that are machined inside the bridge itself. The loop end of the string is held at the back of the guitar by a piece of hardware called the ferrule. A ferrule. Or ferrule. Wenge. Inside joke. To drill the string through holes, I first used the drill press to make this jig, which is just a block of MDF in which I drilled 6 perfectly straight and equally spaced holes. The space between the holes is going to depend on the type of bridge you bought. To drill the recesses for the ferrules, I used the same method with the different jig. And again, depending on the ferrules you bought, the size of the hole may vary. When this is done, we'll flip the body and then drill 6 larger recesses, so we can put the ferrules in place. On commercial versions of the Tele, there's actually an additional recess, so the top of the ferrule is flush with the back of the guitar. Now you can put the bridge back in place and mark the approximate position of the bridge pickup. Print out the plan once again and cut out this shape. Then use the negative shape to lay out the bridge pickup cavity. Making all those cavities is very easy, so I won't be covering that part in detail. You can mess up this part quite a bit, and it won't make any difference because everything will be covered by the pickguard anyway. So it doesn't need to be pretty, just functional. Same as with the neck pocket, you can use a Forstner bit to remove the bulk of the material and get to the desired depth at the same time. Then use the chisel to knock out every bit of wood left in between and clean out the edges. Rinse and repeat for all 3 cavities. The guitar is pretty much done now, and we'll spend a little time taking care of the final details before putting the finish on. As I told you in the second part, my fretboard is a little too short just after the nut, so my transition is a bit funny looking, but I'm okay with it. I used the chisel to create a slope between the fretboard and the headstock, and then refined it with a file and some sandpaper. Now is also time to fine-tune all the transitions, so I used the file and sandpaper again. Here I'm making sure that the back of the neck is perfectly straight. To do that, I stuck a piece of sandpaper to a flat piece of wood and carefully removed any high spots along the neck. It's also during this step that I extend the radius of the neck to the fretboard. That transition is very important because that's what you actually feel in the palm of your hand when you're playing the guitar. And if you leave it too sharp, it's going to feel very uncomfortable. Don't forget to sand every last detail on the guitar. I used the chisel to fine-tune the side of the neck pocket. It's not critical, but it looks better. Don't forget to make the 2 roundovers at the heel. To do that, I used the chisel. To make the body contour roundovers, I guess you could use a Dremel, but a router would be ideal. Since I couldn't use any of those, I used the chisel. I started by marking the top and sides with this monstrosity, which is basically an IKEA pencil attached to a dowel with a couple of zip ties. This allowed me to draw 2 lines, one on the top and one on the side, at an equal distance from the edge. And then it was just a matter of removing the wood between those lines. It looks easy, and it actually is, but you'll have to be mindful of the grain orientation at all times to avoid tear out. When you're done, you can use some sandpaper to break the 2 hard edges. After that, you can make the final sanding on the entire guitar. To install the side dots, just drill a shallow hole on the side of the fretboard. Insert the side dot tube and cut it flush with a chisel. If you lay it out correctly, nothing can go wrong. Also, I didn't put fret markers on this guitar, but it's also very easy to do, especially if you do it before the radiusing of the fretboard. If you're planning on using a water-based dye like I did, it's a good idea to raise the grain with some hot water before the final sanding. But make sure you check your local policies regarding child labor before doing that. So here I'm applying the dye. This one comes from Rubio Monocoat, which is technically a Belgian brand. I'll leave a link to the products I used. Once the dye was dry, I used another product from Rubio, which is a finishing oil that only requires 1 application. I chose a white one because I wanted the grain to pop out. This is the first time that I went out of my very odd finishing routine. Ever since I started woodworking 3 years ago, I've been finishing every single one of my projects the same way. I first apply several coats of tung oil and then let it cure between the coats. And then I use a wipe-on polyurethane on top. It's probably not the best way, and for a lot of technical reasons, but it has always worked for me. I like the natural look of the wood, with the grain popping out, as well as the extra protection and the very light sheen of the polyurethane. In the end, this is just a finish, and you get to choose whatever you want, whether it's shellac, oil, wax, nitrocellulose, polyurethane, or even paint. Ibanez even used Steve Weiss' own blood mixed with paint for their Gem DNA series, so I guess you could use any body fluid you want. Before putting the finish on the neck and headstock, I drilled the holes for the tuners. You can use the template to find the exact location of the holes. Don't forget to put some scrap wood behind the headstock while you drill the holes. That way you will avoid blowouts. On this neck, I used tung oil and poly. If your fretboard is something like ebony, wenge, or rosewood, you can choose to leave it unfinished. When the finish is dry, you can install the tuners and screw the neck in place. If you haven't yet, put the ferrules in place. Here I'm simply making a little cut between the neck pocket and the neck pickup cavity, so I can adjust the truss rod later on without having to remove the entire neck every time. The guitar is almost ready now, and we can work on the frets. I won't be covering this part too much because I'm still learning, and fret leveling as well as the general setup is an art on its own. I'll leave a link to a very useful book that I purchased. It was written by Dan ERLEWINE from StewMac, and I use it all the time. First, I lay the neck flat on the workbench and adjust the truss rod so that the neck has a very slight relief in the middle. Here I used a straight piece of plexi with notches for the frets, but you can do the same thing with a piece of cardboard. Then I mark the top of every fret with a Sharpie, so I can check my progress. When that was done, I used a fret leveling beam with 320 and 400 grit sandpaper. And then I went across the whole fretboard until all my fret tops were at the same level. You'll know when you're done when all the Sharpie is gone. That means that you don't have any high or low spot left behind. You can check your result by using a fret rocker or a business card. Working by groups of 3 frets, try to rock the tool from side to side. If it moves, that means that the fret in the middle is still too high, and you need to work on it. Next, I used a crowning file to recrown all the fret tops. This is a specialty tool, but you don't really need it. For my first build, I used a regular metal file. Mark the fret tops with a Sharpie again and remove some material, so that you only leave a very thin strip on the top of the fret. I finished by polishing the frets with some extra fine steel wool. On some of my other builds, I also used a Dremel and some polishing compound. Now it's time to connect the pickup cavities to the control cavity. To do that, you'll need a very long drill bit. Also, don't forget to make an additional hole that goes from underneath the bridge to the control cavity, so you can ground the bridge on the back of a pot. Here I'm shielding all the cavities with aluminum foil. That will keep the electromagnetic interferences from messing up with my sweet masking tape tone. I just realized that I completely forgot to film the jack socket installation. Well, it's just a 22mm hole, and all you need to do is drill it straight into the control cavity. Just spot the location of the hole using the plan. Now you can feed the pickup wires through their channel and screw the bridge in place. Okay, now about the electronics. As with the setting up of the guitar, going through the entire wiring would take a whole tutorial. But it's not that complicated if you carefully follow the wiring diagram that comes with every set of pickups. I'll leave a link in the description to an amazing YouTube channel called 6 String Supplies, which features videos covering every type of wiring you could dream of, with a lot of details and useful tips for beginners. I learned everything I know about soldering from watching their videos. If soldering your own circuit seems intimidating to you, you can also buy a pre-wired harness, but you'll still have to connect it to the pickups. So why not take a leap of faith and try out the real thing? Now put the strings on, and there you have it, your first custom handmade guitar. Now, do you miss bird watching? Yeah, that's what I thought. There's still a few minutes left before this video reaches the usual 20 to 25 minutes mark of the channel. So I'm going to take that time to talk about a few key aspects that only occurred to me after the first video was released. The ultimate goal of this series was to make amateur guitar making less mystical and more accessible to literally anyone who's ever wanted to build a guitar. According to the feedback that I got on the 2 first videos, many of you made the final jump and started buying the tools and wood, and some even started working on the actual project, and I couldn't be more grateful for your trust. That being said, I suspect that others are still pondering if they should give it a try, even now that you've seen all the steps involved. That hesitation may come from very practical reasons, like financial hardship, especially during those trying times, but it can also come from the lack of space and experience for heavy machines. Or maybe you just want to make one guitar and going through all the steps I showed seems like a lot for a one-time thing. So one thing that you must understand is that I developed a strange obsession with wood 3 years ago. And I'm still fascinated by the fact that I can buy a very ugly and twisted board from the shop and turn it into a functional piece of equipment. And I can totally get that not everyone will share my enthusiasm regarding handling a plane around roughs on wood. And though machining the wood is a mandatory step in the making of an instrument, it doesn't mean that you have to do it on your own. You could go on a webshop like madentor.com. It's a company based in Spain, and they're one of the biggest stone suppliers in Europe. And you can get your 3 blanks pre-dimensioned from there. Here I've got some fretboard blanks, a pre-glued body blank, and a fancy flamed maple neck blank. And all I had to do was open the door to the delivery guy. One of the fretboard blank is even pre-slotted, so that could be an option if you're afraid that accuracy could be an issue. When I'll use those parts, I'll still be able to call the final product a handmade and custom guitar, even though I didn't prepare the wood myself. You can push this reasoning one step further with guitar kits. Essentially, I've learned guitar making by copying an existing guitar. I stripped it down to the bare wood, then inspected, measured, and copied every part and put it back together. So assembling a guitar kit is an ideal exercise. Plus, it gives you a head start on finishing and the electronics. All that's left to learn is to make the wooden parts from scratch. And that's what this series was all about. Another problem you might have with this series is that it's about making a Telecaster, and you had a different guitar in mind. Well, as I said in the first video, the Tele is the simplest guitar that exists, and all the other guitars are just slightly more complicated versions of the Tele. At least that's what I'm thinking. When you'll be done with this Tele, nothing keeps you from learning new construction techniques, like gluing a set neck, or building a neck through, a semi-hollow body guitar with bent sides and a carved top, putting an angle on the headstock, using plastic or wooden bindings, laminating a neck, design a custom body or headstock shape, or even build a different instrument like a bass or an ukulele. The list goes on and on. One last thing that could hold you back is that you might not know anything about woodworking. Well, last year I didn't know anything about guitar making, and now I'm joking about masking tape tone. You don't need to know everything about woodworking to make a guitar, and I certainly don't. You only need to understand a few key principles, and I'm also happy to tell you that if you've been a long-time viewer, you've already passively learned a lot just by watching me using my tools. Okay, now I've run out of arguments. If you don't want to build a guitar at this point, then just go back to the fields and creepingly stalk those disgusting birds.